Hey everyone, thanks to all of you who are supporting this horror story channel by subscribing and liking every video. I love you all. For those of you who are new to my channel, if you like scary stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so that our Creepypasta community can grow even bigger. Let's get to the horror story right away. Stay tuned until the end of the video because there will be some interesting twists in this scary story. I've worked as a child psychiatrist for over 20 years. I've seen a spectrum of cases that defy easy categorization. Children who hear voices, children lost in their own fragmented realities, and a few whose brilliance touches the edge of insanity. But Mark was different. Mark didn't fit into any box. He didn't speak much. His gaze never lingered on people, but instead hovered over the edges of tables, the corners of ceilings, or his tightly gripped notebook. He was 11, but looked younger, perpetually hunched, with a discomfort in his own skin that was impossible to miss. His mother, exasperated and defeated, described him as a boy who lived in numbers and nowhere else. Mark loved numbers. In fact, it bordered on obsession. Probability, equations, patterns. His fixation was relentless. That obsession was what brought him into my office now. 5 days ago, Emily Collins, a chubby-faced, gap-toothed 4-year-old, vanished from her front yard. One moment she was there, drawing with chalk on the pavement. The next, she was gone. Nobody had seen anything. That is, except for Mark. Mark had been there that day, perched on the curb across the street, scribbling in his notebook, while his mother shopped at the corner store. He was the last person known to see Emily before she disappeared. The police had questioned him, but they got nothing comprehensible in return. He wasn't uncooperative, but he filtered the world through logic nobody else could follow. He isn't like other kids, his mother had said, wringing her hands. But he's not a bad boy. He just doesn't communicate the way people expect. Now it was my turn to try. Mark, I began, seated across from him in my dimly lit office. Do you remember what happened the day Emily disappeared? Mark didn't look up. His pencil scratched furiously across the ruled notebook paper in front of him. The page was filled with numbers and what appeared to be diagrams, abstract, confusing things that didn't reveal any obvious meaning. She left, he said finally, his voice flat and cold, an unsettling match to his full, expressionless face. I told her, but she left. His words startled me. Until that moment, I hadn't been sure he would even respond. You told her what? To stay. He paused, chewing slightly on the inside of his cheek. To stay in the yard. I told her. She didn't listen. I leaned forward. What wasn't safe outside the yard, Mark? Was there someone there? She didn't listen, he repeated, with a strange emphasis. Then he stopped, tapping his pencil against his notebook. Mark, who did you see in Emily's yard? His pencil froze mid-tap, the silence heavy and charged. Finally, he flipped to a clean page in his notebook and began to sketch. It wasn't much, but as the shapes began to form, I realized he was drawing what looked like a truck. A familiar chill settled over me when he added what appeared to be a clipboard. A man? I asked gently. He nodded. What kind of man? For the first time, Mark made eye contact. His pupils dilated slightly as he said, the kind who picks picks. The probabilities, he whispered. It's about the probabilities. Before I could untangle his cryptic response, Mark dropped his notebook onto my lap. Across the page, in stark, angular handwriting, was a single word scrawled over the truck sketch. Choice. It made no sense. A man who picks, probability, a choice. I needed more context, but I knew better than to press too hard. Mark could shut down as quickly as he opened up. Instead, I turned the page. More numbers, spirals, and chaotic patterns spilled before me. But one thing caught my attention. He had circled a particular equation at least 10 times, emphasizing it with a red marker. Beside it, another word was scrawled, this one underlined. North. North? I echoed aloud. Mark blinked slowly. You'll find her there, I think. His sudden uncertainty froze me. What do you mean, you think? Sometimes. He changes things, Mark muttered. He wants it to be hard. He doesn't like the obvious. Who, Mark? I asked. Who's making these choices? Mark glanced nervously at the door. If I tell you wrong, then it's my fault. What's your fault? His voice dropped to a whisper, one so soft I leaned all the way forward just to catch it. If the next one disappears. The next one. Ice flooded my chest. Driving north with Mark and Mrs. Collins felt like plunging into an abyss. The late afternoon sky was overcast, the light diffused and grey, matching the tightening knot in my stomach. Mark sat in the back seat, listlessly flipping through his notebook like it was a guidebook, though it betrayed no clear answers. Mrs. Collins wrung her hands in her lap, her eyes bloodshot from days of crying. She had barely spoken since we left her house. I wasn't sure whether out of grief, fear, or both. Where are we going? She asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was trembling, as though she dreaded the answer. North, Mark said calmly, without looking up. He likes the wilderness, where there's nothing to trip him up, fewer variables. Mark, who? I asked, keeping my voice steady as I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. This man you keep mentioning, what do you mean by variables? He hesitated, his little fingers tracing along the edges of the notebook's pages before speaking, his voice adopting that eerie flatness I'd come to dread. Choices. He designs them. He watches probabilities like a game. He tilted his head in contemplation. He's very good at it. A game. Mrs. Collins turned her wide, tear-filled eyes toward him. What kind of game? What does he want? Mark finally met her gaze. He doesn't want. He calculates. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, nausea rising as his fragmented explanations chipped away at what little sense remained. It was clear that Mark wasn't inventing this from the depths of his imagination. His answers were too specific, too deliberate, and yet the rational part of me railed against it. The idea of someone abducting a child because of some mathematical fixation was absurd, wasn't it? We drove in silence for another 20 minutes before Mark suddenly perked up, pressing his hands against the window. Here, he said, turn here. I squinted at the unmarked country road he indicated. It snaked into dense forest, nothing but towering pines and shadows stretching as far as the eye could see. Are you sure? Mark didn't answer, only nodding as I obliged. The dirt road jostled us as the car crawled over uneven terrain, and my sense of unease grew heavier with every passing second. Finally, we came to a clearing, a sprawling patch of flat earth surrounded by trees. There was a single structure at its center, little more than a dilapidated wooden shack that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Mark pointed. He was here. Mrs. Collins's breath hitched as she opened the car door, stumbling out before I could stop her. "Emily!" she screamed, her anguished voice reverberating through the stillness. "Emily, are you here? Emily!" "Wait," I said, chasing after her as she barreled toward the shack. Mark followed us at his own measured pace, his face disturbingly serene. The shack's door was slightly ajar, creaking mournfully as Mrs. Collins shoved it open. Inside, the air was thick and musty, filled with the scent of decay. Dust motes floated in the dim light filtering through a crack in the ceiling. The space was empty, save for a table in the corner. Something metallic glinted on its surface. Mrs. Collins rushed to it, gasping when she saw what was there. A small pair of rainbow-colored hair clips. "These are hers," she cried, clutching them to her chest. "These are Emily's." I stared at the table. There was something else next to the clips. A small slip of paper, folded neatly. My hands trembled as I picked it up and unfolded it. Written in neat, deliberate handwriting were two words that sent a chill through my entire body. "Good choice." I stepped back, my head swimming. "Mark, what is this?" Without waiting for my question, Mark wandered further into the shack. He crouched, examining the floorboards with that same unsettling focus. He gave his equations. "Not all chains are visible," he murmured, more to himself than to us. With a swift movement, he tugged up a loose piece of wood, revealing a trapdoor beneath. Mrs. Collins dropped the clips and lunged forward, clawing at the trapdoor's latch. "Help me," she cried. I hesitated for a moment, but then leaned down to help her pull it open. The smell hit us first, a sour, metallic odor that turned my stomach. The space beneath was dark, but as Mrs. Collins pulled out her phone and aimed its flashlight downward, the weak beam illuminated what lay below. It was a small, hollowed-out room, no larger than a storage space. The walls were lined with hooks and ropes, but worst of all was the chair in the center. A single child's chair, painted bright red, sat facing the farthest wall. There was no sign of Emily. Mrs. Collins backed away, trembling and hyperventilating, her cries echoing in the empty room. "No, no, no, no." Mark stepped closer to the opening, his expression blank. He's already moved her. He doesn't like leaving pieces behind once the chain starts. "What chain, Mark?" I demanded, my voice shaking as I grabbed his shoulders and turned him to face me. "What chain?" Mark blinked up at me, unruffled by my panic. "The one you stepped into when you came here." I froze, my grip faltering. "What are you talking about?" He looked toward Mrs. Collins, who was now curled up on the floor, weeping uncontrollably. "He likes to collect." "You broke the game," Mark said softly. "He didn't account for you. That makes it unpredictable." For the first time, I noticed his fingers tighten around the edges of his notebook, and there was something frantic in his eyes. Too many moving parts now. Too many ways for it to go wrong. He won't like that. Before I could respond, the sound of an engine rumbled in the distance. My heart slammed in my chest as headlights pierced through the trees, illuminating the clearing. A black truck crawled toward the shack. Mark's voice was calm, almost resigned. "He's here." The truck came to a slow stop, its engine rumbling like a beast roused from slumber. The headlights bathed the clearing in harsh, sterile light, cutting through the darkness that had wrapped us like a shroud. Mrs. Collins was frozen on the ground, her sobs muffled by the sleeve of her sweater, but Mark stood perfectly still, meeting the truck's glare as if he had been expecting it. I couldn't move. My instinct screamed to run, to grab Mrs. Collins and Mark and drive as far away as possible. But I couldn't tear my eyes away as the driver's side door opened with an ominous creak. A man stepped out. He was tall, his frame almost gaunt under the tailored cut of his dark coat. Everything about him looked polished, yet unnervingly sterile. His short cropped hair, the clean manicured hands clutching a clipboard, and an expression so neutral it was as if someone had erased it. His eyes, however, burned with clinical intent. They flickered to Mrs. Collins for a moment before landing on me, stripping me bare with one cold sweep. "Doctor." "Holloway," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "I'm glad you decided to come. How do you know my name?" The words tumbled from my lips, sharper than I intended, but my fear drowned out decorum. He smiled faintly and tapped the clipboard with his index finger. "I know everything I need to. It's part of the system." "What system?" I demanded, stepping protectively in front of Mark, though I felt absurd trying to shield him when I was trembling. "What the hell is this?" "Efficiency," he replied simply, as though the word explained everything. He turned his focus to Mark, tilting his head slightly. "You've been talking, haven't you?" Mark's voice was eerily steady as he stared at the man. "I calculate better than you." The man's smile tightened. "Perhaps, but calculation without oversight leads to error. You've overstepped, Mark." "Where is Emily?" Mrs. Collins' voice was raw and broken as she rose unsteadily to her feet. Her hands balled into fists at her sides. "Where is my daughter, you sick bastard?" "She's safe," the man answered, his tone devoid of emotion. "Safer than she was before, statistically speaking." Mrs. Collins lunged at him screaming, but he made no move to stop her. She stumbled halfway, collapsing to her knees. "Why?" she sobbed, her fist pounding the dirt. "Why are you doing this?" The man crouched slightly, his clipboard resting on one knee. He regarded her with an almost detached curiosity, like she wasn't a grieving mother but an anomaly in his calculations. People misunderstand risk. They underestimate it at every turn, Mrs. Collins. I manage it, I stepped forward. By taking children. He turned his gaze to me, almost pitying. Children are variables, their movements, their choices, unpredictable. It skews the data. I remove them only when probabilities suggest imminent harm. It's not personal. It's necessary. My stomach lurched. "You're saying you protect them by abducting them." "Not protect," he corrected. "Optimize." Emily was vulnerable in her environment. The probability of a catastrophic event involving her was unacceptably high. Mrs. Collins screamed, pure rage and grief shattering the air. "You're insane." "Insanity is the absence of order," he replied coolly. This is order. His gaze darkened as he shifted his attention back to Mark. But your interference has disrupted it. You've introduced noise into the system. Mark didn't flinch, his small frame still and unyielding. Noise is everywhere. You just don't like it when you can't control it. The man straightened, his face unreadable. Your calculations are impressive, Mark, but flawed. You think you found her, yet you brought them all here. Why? Mark clutched his notebook to his chest. His voice was quiet but resolute. Because you can't resist running the probabilities, even when they're against you. The man's calm veneer cracked for the first time. His eyes narrowed as he stepped closer to Mark, looming over him. You think you've outmaneuvered me? Mark nodded. If I didn't, you wouldn't be here. There was a beat of stillness, so tense it felt like the entire forest had stopped breathing. Then the man inhaled deeply, his expression smoothing into something almost wistful. You forced my hand, he said softly. Reaching into his coat, he pulled out a key and held it up in the light. There's always a choice. That's what makes it tolerable. But choices have costs. He walked past Mark and me, towards the shack. Without hesitation, he descended into the trapdoor below. Mrs. Collins bolted after him, ignoring my attempts to stop her. Inside the underground room, chaos erupted. The man coolly unlocked another hidden door, and there she was. Emily, alive, frail, dirty, but breathing. Mrs. Collins wept as she cradled her daughter, her cries of relief unbearable to hear. But the man stayed calm, watching silently, as if he'd predicted this moment exactly. Your intervention, he said, addressing me now, has unbalanced the system. Now the adjustment must be severe. What adjustment? I yelled, my throat raw. He turned to Mark. You knew this would happen. Mark's voice was steady, without regret. Fixing probabilities doesn't make sense when you're the wrong variable. You'll lose control. The man's lips curled into a thin smile. Perhaps. Or perhaps I'm simply shifting the paradigm. Before anyone could stop him, he scribbled on his clipboard, placed it down, and stepped out. Mark walked over to read what he'd written. He turned, his face pale, the slightest tremor in his hands. What does it say? I asked. Mark met my eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. It's your name. And then the truck roared to life again, the tail lights melting into the darkness, leaving us in the grim silence of unresolved probabilities.